Now, I'm kind of using marriage as an Am I done? Okay, here's the funny thing about this, because this wasn't planned. This morning we're talking about communication. That communicates. Last week we started in this foundation. We're talking about kind of marriage, but we're using marriage as a framework for how we even have any relationships. And there's keys to effective and growing and great relationships that I think are illustrated in our marriages, because God describes our relationship with Jesus in the same way as a husband and wife and how they relate to each other. So that's what we're looking at, as we're looking at this idea. And we talked last week that there's got to be a foundation of trust. We looked at Ephesians 5, where it said, submit to one another as to the Lord, and how that word submit really has a foundation of trust. So this morning, I want to start with a little illustration, and since it's Father's Day, I'm going to use a dad, and I was trying to think of what would be the best way to select a dad to help me out this morning. So I thought maybe I'll use the dad who has the youngest child here, that just recently maybe had a child whose name may or may not be Rexford. So, Scott, I think that's you. So yes, give Scott a hand here. So, and Scott, we hung out yesterday morning at Richland Pregnancy Services, run 5K walk, and I didn't prep you for this at all, did I? No. You want to know why? Why? Because I didn't think of how great it would be until this morning to use you. To have you voluntold to do this. So I have a little illustration here that I want to talk about, just trust and everything, and I feel like we're getting to know each other, but I think I have your trust. So we're going to do a little trust exercise here. You willing to kind of play along with me here? Sure. I think you're a good sport. We better start by putting this on. You like? No, I got a hole in it.
Okay.
I do, don't I? Yeah. All right, so let's do this. So you probably like that shirt, so you don't need your arms. That would only stop me from doing. From you. So you're good. But you know what? I think just because we got carpet and everything here, maybe you should stand on the plastic.
What's going on here?
You trust me, right? You know what? I want to tell you. I want to give you something that I feel from the bottom of my heart you deserve.
Okay.
I think your wife would agree with me. And but you're all right there?
Yeah,
all right. Okay, you're on the plastic and everything. Now, here's the thing though, because we're talking about trust, I don't want you to be able to see what we're doing. And I couldn't find a blindfold. There's holes in this side, so we're just going to put this on backwards. So let's just do this. You good?
Yep, good.
All right, I want to just pull it up a little bit here because I want you to be able to talk. There you go. Here we go. Let's see his mouth. That way we get a lot of reaction there. Okay. So, you good?
Yep.
Are you getting this? Okay, this is good. This is good. I am going to give you something that you truly deserve, okay? No, seriously, here's a towel. You may want to have that there close by. You're really gonna like this. So. What? I mean it. I wouldn't steer you wrong here. Okay, so I want you to take your hands are kind of tied. So no, all right, we'll do it this way. I want you to just tip your head back a little bit here. This is good. Just, don't fall over. Okay, and just open up. Bite. How is that?
Not too bad.
All right, well, it is McDonald's. It wasn't too bad. You can finish it up. Thank you very much for playing along. Now, Scott, let me ask you before you go off, is that what you expected?
Actually, I thought I was going to get something dumped over my head.
Yeah. I wonder why that was, that you thought that. Did I ever say that I was going to do something mean and nasty to you? What did I tell you, Scott? I was going to give you something that I felt that you deserved. You deserved a McDonald's apple pie because you deserve a break today. I really shouldn't use that unless McDonald's is giving me props for it, but here's the thing: is I wanted to illustrate something like this. For some of you, wouldn't have played along with me, would you? No. And maybe that's because you trust me a little too much. But the reality is, without trust, when I started putting plastic bags and blindfolds, and I had you guys kind of helping with the oohing and youing and everything like that, you would have headed for the hills. You would have been like, I don't think I'm into this. I don't think this is going to be a good thing. And one of the things I was trying to get us to say is that without trust, we don't even stay in the conversation. And that's where, last week where we started talking about trust, it was so foundational. But as we build upon that, we're not just looking at trust. In this series, we're looking at trust, we're looking at intimacy, we're looking at health, and this morning particularly, we're looking at communication. Now, how many people here are good communicators? What does that mean? I mean, I could say I'm a good communicator. I stand up here every Sunday morning and I talk a lot. Who said yeah? Okay, let's do this for 30 minutes for Bethany. See how God grows you now. Love you, Bethany. But here's the thing: is even though I can think I'm a competent communicator, that doesn't necessarily mean just because I can get up here and I can talk and I can put a sentence together sometimes, that I'm an effective communicator. And I think a lot of us would admit we're all communicators, right? We all communicate. We communicate all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're good at it or we're effective with it, because oftentimes, if you really had to admit it, how many times has what you intended to communicate got you in trouble? A lot. It's one of the downsides of communicating all the time. But here's the thing. Stephen Covey says this. Stephen Covey says, trust is the glue of life. It is the most essential ingredient in effective communication. It's the foundational principle that holds all relationships. So whether it's in a marriage or in friendship or in family relationships or in work relationships, really this idea of trust and communication, they're playing together. And I want us to understand that when trust and communication play together in the same sandbox, it looks like this. You have to communicate effectively to build trust. But you also need but if you're going to build trust, you need to communicate effectively. You see that? If you're going to communicate effectively, you need trust. To grow your trust, you need to communicate effectively. And a lot of times in our closer relationships, a lot of our communication isn't even verbal, right? Like with Scott, what I was telling him was one thing. What he was understanding was something very different, right? And if you don't believe me, anybody here that's married knows what I mean because you have had this conversation. Hey, honey, how you doing? I'm fine. Yes? Had this conversation? What do the words say? I'm fine. I'm okay. Nothing's wrong. But what's really being communicated? You are in trouble. You did something wrong. Right? So just talking, just words, is not the whole evidence of communication. And what ends up happening, especially in those relationships closest to us, in those relationships where we know each other the best and we know each other the longest, communication often gets shortcutted. Because we assume we know what the other person's thinking. We know what they're like. We know what they mean. We know what they intend. Or we just get lazy and don't even think about it. But here's the problem. Relational problems are rooted in selfish communication. If you have a relational problem, I guarantee you, I promise you, the basis of it is that it is selfish communication. We don't think about it. In fact, it's more because we do it by default. It's not like that we're going out of our way to be selfish in our communication. It's just that we're just kind of being natural in it. We're not thinking about it. We get this idea of it just happens. But that's why in this series we're talking about till death do your part. It's saying that I'm going to be cognitive, I'm going to be connecting, and I'm going to be aware that I have a part to play in effective communication, in building trust in my relationship. Because I can't tell you how many times when I've talked to a couple, not even a married couple sometimes, even somebody maybe it's engaged or even in families, and this is what they'll say when they have a relational breakdown. They just don't understand me. And you can hear this from people that have been together for years. They could be married for 20 years, and they'll sit there and they'll have a tension and a break, and they'll go, they've just never understood me. Well, who in the world would think that somebody should understand you after living with you for 20 years, right? Why does that happen? How does that happen? It happens because we just aren't conscientious. We're not proactive about having good communication. But here's the thing. God is a communicator. Do you believe that? God has communicated from the very beginning. In fact, it says that God spoke and the universes were created. He was such a communicator that his very words created the world and the universe and the stars and everything and put them into place. God is that big of a communicator. And here's the thing. We were created in the image of God. We were created to be communicators. And so this picture of God being a communicator and thus us being a communicator, we should take it seriously because there's something about in relationships that we're supposed to be communicators. But yet we don't always do it so well and relationships break down. So I want to go back to the main text that we started with last week in Ephesians chapter 5. We looked at this idea in Ephesians chapter 5 that it starts with Paul saying to submit to one another out of reverence, out of respect, out of honor for the Lord. Okay? And then he goes on and he gives descriptions of what that looks like. And first he describes what it looks like for wives and then for husbands. And then he goes on and he talks about for parents and children. And then he goes on and he talks about for slaves and masters. He gives these illustrations. And we read the passage that illustrated last week how husbands and wives should submit to one another, what that would look like in practice. And one of the passages here that I think gets at this is in Ephesians 5, verse 25. And this is the example of how husbands submit to their wives. And it says, for husbands, this means love your wives just as Christ loved the church. He gave himself up for her to make her holy and clean, washed by the cleansing of the word. Well, there's a picture there, and some people, you look at that and you read it and you sit there and say, well, I don't get how that has anything to do with communication necessarily. It's not just saying with your words or when you speak or whatever, do this. It's just saying that you should love your wives as Christ loved the church, and he gave himself up for her to make her holy and clean. Well, I think the basis here that you get about the submission is that healthy communication is rooted in love. Now, we don't always know what that word means, that word love. And you could sit there and say, well, yeah, that's great, Tony. It says, husbands, you should love your wives, as Christ loved the church. Why is that to have anything to do with communication? Well, you got to back up a little bit. I want to go back to Ephesians chapter 4 for a second. So one chapter ahead of this, Paul was describing something. And in Ephesians 4:15, he says, "Instead, we speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church." Okay, so you speak the truth in love, just like Christ loved the church, and then you go into chapter 5:25, it says, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church." Do you see a connection here? Now we're talking about communication. And what Paul was talking about, what God kind of laid on his heart to communicate to us is this, is that people feed off of what you give them, right? We see it in relationships. You know, if you go somewhere and somebody treats you rudely, your inclination is to be nicer to them, right? Don't lie to me. You know, when somebody treats us rude and when somebody's hostile to us, what do? We get hostile back. You know, when we feel like somebody's attacking us, what do? We get defensive, right? That's our natural tendency is to want to blame and project and put things on. And I'll tell you, whenever we default to giving back those negative vibes, those negative feelings, that negative communication, it never ends well. Because what happens? You've been in these conversations. What happens? Somebody wins, right? And then everything's all over, right? Does anybody ever win in those conversations? But if we took on the picture of love, if we took on the picture of Christ sacrificially loving his church, if we took on communicating with that mode and that mindset, and people were fueled off that, it would change our entire relationship with one another, especially with husbands and wives. But I know, okay, so guys, dads, men, boys of all ages, we're going to have a talk here for a second. Because we've been somewhat fairly assessed as not being good communicators. We don't talk like women do, unless it's about sports or fishing. You know, we don't talk about feelings. We talk about real things, right, men? We talk about important things, like how to tune a 345 4-quart V8. Was I even close? No, I didn't think so. Dustin's looking at me, he goes, he doesn't know what he's talking about. That was me trying to talk engines. But the reality is this, and I think we men sometimes live by this. Well, if I don't have anything nice to say, I've always been told. Yeah. You notice who finished that sentence, don't you? Didn't hear any male voices. Well, here's the thing. I believe that love finds something nice to say. See, our default a lot of times as men is that if we don't want to add to the conversation, if we don't think that it's, you know, something we want to engage in, then we just don't, you know. But the reality is love finds a way to communicate, finds a way to say something nice. Because words are important, words are powerful. When they're used properly, they add to understanding, they add to encouragement, they add to building somebody else up. But because they're powerful, when they're used poorly, they add to offenses and division and struggles. That's why when I talk to couples, one of the things that I give them, especially in a premarital kind of context, I mean, it actually works for people that have already been married. You don't have to do it in a premarried context, is I encourage them in their communication to have what I call rules of engagement. Okay? It's you're kind of setting up how you're going to communicate with one another in tense and difficult situations. Because here's the problem, is when you have a strain and a crisis and a difficulty in your relationship, that is not a good time to set up rules for how you're going to communicate. In fact, it's the worst time. because it ends up just being continued strife and difficulty. But however, if when you're communicating well, if when your relationship is strong, if when everything is going good in your relationship, you set aside and you say, when we get in these times, this is how we're going to relate to one another. Then when you get in those times of crisis, you can go back to that and say, remember how we practiced that this is how we're going to do it? Then you've agreed upon it and you said, this is what we're going to do. So let me give you some examples of what I suggest is, a lot of times men tend to be processors. We tend to disconnect a little bit. We come home from work where, maybe, had a stressful day. We don't want to get into anything, but maybe wives, you sit there and you go, I want to talk about the day. I want to process it. God created me to kind of, work through all of this kind of stuff. So, I come in and I'm just wanting to go. Well, who's right? Huh? Mom's right? Is that what? No. Oh, both are right. Okay. Thought we were going to go off the deep end there. Both, all right. Well, who's right? Well, again, it could be both. So what you need to decide is you need to sit there and say, okay, when we have a difficulty, when there's a struggle or a tension especially, and we're going to say we're not going to do it, we're not going to talk about it when we're tired. We're not going to talk about it when we're busy. We're going to agree that those are not effective times to push this conversation forward. And I'll tell you, it's hard. I mean, even in my marriage, there are times that my wife and I don't get a chance to talk some days until, we're both crashing into bed at night. And I'll tell you, after 9 o'clock, I don't function. That's past my bedtime. And I invite her all the time to get up at 5 a.m. with me and talk, but she's just yet to take me up on it. But again, neither one of those are right. If it's important, if it's something we need to talk about, then we need to make time. We need to find time that works for both of us to talk about it. So that's a rule of engagement. Another one, as I said, that I suggest is always believe the best in the other person. Can you see how that would change all your communication? Is if no matter what you're doing, you choose to believe the best, that the other person has your best intentions in mind. One of the other ones, and this is a big one in our day and age, is when you're in conflict in your relationship, you will never deal with that conflict in any way other than in person. You want your relationship to take a nosedive? Start getting mad at each other and start texting. Their emojis aren't going to help you. I don't care if it's the cute little one with the kiss blowing out. You're so irritating. Yeah, that little kiss don't mean nothing. But one of the rules of engagement is that when we're talking about important things, when we're talking about struggle, we do it in person. But if you try to set those rules up when you're in crisis or conflict, it will not go well. So you have to do it. You have to practice it when you're not. That's what love does. That's what it's rooted in love. That healthy communication is saying that we're going to, out of love for one another, do whatever we need to do to make this happen. Second thing I think we can get from this passage in Ephesians 5 is that effective communication is selfless. Paul says that you're supposed to love your wives as Christ loved the church. What did Christ do? He gave his life for her. He set aside his own personal best and gave it to his wife, his bride. He gave his life. And if we did that in communication, if we were looking selflessly at how to communicate, what we would find is that marriage isn't supposed to be a solo. It's a duet. There's a picture there, and I'm not a singer, but I've talked to a musical person, and she agrees that I have the right mode here. A soloist, sings their notes, and they make themselves sound wonderful. They want to make their own voice and their own performance come forward. But when you're in a duet, you're listening to the other person. You're trying to hear their rhythm and you're trying to stay in line with them. And not only are you wanting to sound good, you're wanting to sound good together. And if somebody in a duet is out to make themselves look good, that duet sounds horrible. If both people in that relationship are only out to make themselves sound good, it'll probably fall apart. But when you're committed to doing it together, when you're committed that even though you may be singing your own notes, but you want to make a beautiful song together, that's where the magic happens. That's what this communication and the selfless communication comes up, is realizing that in communication, our goal should be to build one another up and not tear them down. Ephesians 4 again, verse 29. Second part of it says, let everything you say be good and helpful, so that your words will be an encouragement to those who hear them. That's our goal. That's our focus. In fact, that's why I believe James says in the book of James in his letter, he says, be slow to speak. That doesn't mean speak slowly so I understand you. It means keep your mouth shut and listen. Open your ears. One of the most difficult things, but one of the most important things to do is to listen if we're going to communicate selflessly. Proverbs 18:13 says, spouting off before listening to the facts is both shameful and foolish. That ever happened to you? That ever happened to you? Probably more heads nodding on the second one. But, I mean, all of us have experienced that in one way. But it's really hard, because really what we want to do oftentimes in communication is to get the other person to understand us. Stephen Covey puts it this way. He has this principle that I love and I try to live by as much as I can. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. But we so often want to seek to make other people understand us. Because if, you know what? My friend Dave over here would just understand me, we'd get along so much better. Why can't you just understand me? If you understood where I was coming from all the time, Dave, man, we do get along well. But the reality is that in our relationships, if we seek to understand the other person, it would give us an entire different platform in which to communicate with one another. But it's so hard because I mentioned this last week. It still is true this week. Men and women are different. Right? Men and women communicate differently. Men and women are wired differently. I mean, yes, it's a generalization. Maybe it's a stereotype. But yeah, God made men and women different. And there's gender differences that we have in communicating. There's personality differences. We're all different people. The world is very glad that I'm not just like Josh Shom, because one of them's enough. He's the original, the only one. Yeah. What did you think I meant something else? Think the best of everybody. So we're different. We have different personalities. We have different life experiences that play into us. We have different ways that we were raised, different things. So all of that comes into affecting how and who we are, and then thus how we communicate, and thus how we listen to one another. Gary Chapman wrote a book years ago, and he's written several series of books since, based on this principle of the 5 love languages. I don't know if some of you have heard this or not, but I found it just kind of an amazing foundational truth in understanding how to listen to one another's differences. Because this is what Gary Chapman says, is he says that there basically are 5 general love languages. A language is a way to communicate, right? So there's basically 5 different love languages, and everybody has a primary and maybe a secondary love language that they hear in the most, that they relate to and they connect with the most. So let me give you an example as I kind of just give you these 5 love languages. One of them, he says, is words of affirmation. Some of us, and we probably know who we are, really appreciate when somebody says an attaboy, good job, I really love what you're doing, either in words or in a note. They love somebody recognizing and giving them direct words affirming who they are and maybe what they have done. They feel loved most when words are used in that way. Other people like myself, my primary love language is acts of service. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't appreciate words of affirmation sometimes, but when somebody goes out of their way to do something and I know they're doing it for me specifically, that means the world to me. I really hear that, and I feel like they understand me and know me when they show me love and appreciation that way. Another one is gifts. My wife is a gifts person. She loves it when I go out and I buy her something. I get her, we call them no occasion flowers. I just buy her flowers. There's no anniversary, there's no birthday, there's no Mother's Day. It's just no occasion flowers. And I like no occasion flowers too because, as I've said before, I'm cheap and they're cheaper on no occasion. But she doesn't mind that I buy her cheap flowers. It's not how much I pay for them that is important. It's that I got them and I got them for her. But she's a gifts person, so she finds that. Other people, it's quality time. I feel most loved and appreciated and understood when we spend time together. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You're probably not texting. But you're giving that person your time, your attention, and your presence. And they feel most loved with that quality time together. The last one he references is that some people feel most loved through physical touch. Usually I get one guy that says, oh yeah, amen. But you might be embarrassed to do that in here. I was kind of waiting for that one. Some of you were thinking it inside, I know. But here's the reality. I want us to understand something about this love language is, some of us maybe, especially in a marriage context, go there with physical touch, but that's not what physical touch means completely. Physical touch is holding hands. It's, giving a hug. It's, just resting your hand on your partner's leg or something like that. They feel connected when they are physically connected to one another in some way, and they feel loved and appreciated most. Now, here's the thing is, with these love languages, some of you are all going to sit there and say, I like them all. Give them to me. I have appreciation for all of them. And that's probably true, that in one way or another, we would appreciate being loved and listened to and connected with and communicated with in all of the love languages. But what Gary Chapman's principle is he says that we really lean towards and we preference one over another. But this is what happens and what breaks down with not listening to one another in a relationship. When we become selfish as opposed to selfless. When we become selfish as opposed to selfless, what we do is we think the other person feels most connected with and understood and loved through our love language. So it's like for me, when I go out of my way to do an act of service for my wife, I think she's going to love this because I went through all of this to do this great thing for her, and she's like, oh, yeah, that was great. But then I buy her some flowers. She goes, oh, that's so wonderful. You're so great. I love these. Yeah. Why? What's the difference? Because I tried to love her with my love language. I tried to speak my love language to her, and she was like, well, that's wonderful and all, but that ain't what I wanted. Where's the flowers? So that's what we do when we don't stop and we don't look at our partner, we don't look at the other person's relationship and say, how can I understand them, know what their love language is, know what they're looking for from me? How can I encourage them? How can I build them up in the way that I hear them and hear where they're at and communicate effectively and selflessly? So what? There's an old adage. Some of you are going to finish this for me. Sticks and stones, but baloney. You know, we tell kids that. It's a little nursery rhyme thing, but I'm going to tell you, anybody that's been in middle school knows words hurt. Words hurt, and they stick. And you don't just get past them. If you don't believe me, ask the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland. Off with their heads! Right? Not very loving. Not very connecting. Not very selfless. Proverbs 18:21 says, the tongue has the power of life and death. For those who love it will eat of its fruit. The tongue, our words, our communication have so much power. And if we want to have a key to an effective relationship, if we want to have a key to of understanding our relationship with God, understanding our relationship with one another, understanding our relationship with our spouse, here it is. We need to practice selfless, loving communication. Communication that doesn't come naturally to us. Communication that doesn't most often just happen. But communication that we're deliberately listening. We're selflessly trying to find out, how can I build the other person up? But I'm going to tell you, that is not something that most of us, it just comes naturally to. In fact, because of our sinful nature, we default to selfish communication. And maybe that seems like a strong word, and you think, no, I'm not selfish with my communication. Well, then, if it's not selfish, I would say at least we default to lazy communication. We just kind of let it happen, and what happens, happens, what's said, and we don't realize that we really need the Spirit of God working in our lives to have the best, most effective communication. That's why, again, going back to Ephesians, going back to chapter 4, all of this was a foundation for what Paul was saying when he said, submit to one another as to the Lord. In Ephesians 4:23, he says, instead, let the Spirit, God's Spirit, renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created to be like God, truly righteous and holy. Do we have the ability to be truly righteous and holy in our own power? No. We default to being sinful. We default to retaliating. We default to going there, to not being effective. But God wants us to have effective, holy, righteous communication. So if you want to know, if you want to understand if that's what you have, if that's where you're at, this is the greatest test I think you can have. The greatest test of whether your communication is being renewed by the Spirit of God, that you're letting God's Spirit work through you, is ask yourself this question. Does my conversation, or do my conversations honor God? When you're getting frustrated, when things aren't clicking, when there's tension and strife in your relationship, is what I'm saying and the way I'm saying it, does it honor God? And if the answer is no, that's when we need to step back and we need to say, Father God, let your Spirit renew me. Let your Spirit take away the selfishness that is trying to manipulate this relationship for evil and turn it to good. It's not natural for us to have effective communication. We need to deliberately do our part. Father, I thank you that you communicate with us so clearly. Nothing communicates with me more effectively than the act of service that you gave through giving your one and only Son. When I didn't deserve it, when I couldn't do anything to earn it, He still gave His life for me, selfishly, selflessly. And I just ask, Father God, that you will let that power that allowed Him to go to the cross for me will allow me to just even hold my tongue in my relationships, and especially my relationship with my spouse, my wife, my love. ask you, Father God, for all of us, that you will help make us better communicators, not just with one another, but with you. That we'll learn to listen to you and hear your heart, hear your voice, and be renewed by your Spirit within us. We praise you. We honor you. Let our lives reflect that. In Jesus' name. Amen. Let's stand and close with this prayer.